Behind every terraced house in post-war Britain lay a strip of soil that meant the difference between hunger and getting by. When wages ran thin and the ration book only stretched so far, families turned to the allotment, coaxing food from clay and cinders. These were survival crops, hardy, cheap, and grown by hands that knew exactly what going without felt like. Some fed a family for a week from a single row. Others were hauled from frozen ground when nothing else would grow. Number one kept more British families alive than any other food in history. Let's count down 25 vegetables poor British families grew when money was tight. Number 25. Mustard and cress. Every windowsill in a lean household had a saucer of mustard and cress growing on a folded flannel. It cost almost nothing. A pinch of seed pressed onto damp cloth, no soil, no garden, no allotment required. Within a week, a green fuzz sprang up on the kitchen sill, ready to snip with scissors for a sandwich or a salad. For families crammed into back-to-back terraces with no plot to their name, this was the one crop anyone could grow. Children were handed the job of keeping the flannel damp, learning the patience of gardening in miniature. By the early 1950s, packets of seed cost a penny or two and lasted a whole season. It was fresh green food in the dead of a coal smoke winter, a splash of pepper and life on bread and margarine. Nothing was grown more cheaply, and nothing tasted more like spring. Number 24. Radishes. Radishes were the first reward of the growing year, the crop that taught impatient children that a garden could feed you. Sown thinly between rows of slower vegetables in March, they were ready to pull in 3 or 4 weeks, their scarlet globes glowing against the dark soil. A packet cost a penny and produced hundreds. For families who could not afford to waste a single inch of an allotment, radishes were the perfect gap filler, cropping and gone before the carrots and onions needed the room. Fathers ate them straight from the ground with a rub on the trouser leg and a shake of salt. Children dared each other over the hottest ones. Sliced thin onto bread and butter, they turned a plain tea into something with a bite. They offered no calories to speak of, but in a hungry spring they offered something almost as precious: the proof that food was coming. Number 23. Lettuce. A row of lettuce meant salad on the table through the summer without a farthing spent at the greengrocer. Poor families sowed hardy varieties like Webb's Wonderful or Little Gem, tough leaves that stood up to the British weather and didn't bolt at the first warm spell. Seed cost pennies, and a single packet gave weeks of cutting. The trick, passed between allotment neighbors, was to sow a short row every fortnight so the supply never ran dry and never came all at once. Slugs were the enemy, picked off by torchlight after dark or fenced out with rings of ash and eggshell. On a Sunday, crisp leaves dressed with salad cream and a sliced boiled egg turned cold meat into a proper meal. In the wilting heat of August, a bowl of homegrown lettuce cost nothing but the growing. It was the taste of a garden earning its keep. Number 22. Spring onions. Spring onions, salad onions, as most families called them, were the thrifty gardener's insurance. Sown in a thin band and left to crowd together, they asked for almost no space and pulled a sharp, clean flavor from the poorest soil. A penny packet lined a whole row, and they cropped early, filling the hungry gap before the main onions were ready. Chopped into mashed potato, they made a Welsh favorite. Scattered over bread and dripping, they cut the richness with a bite of green. Children were sent to thin the rows, and the thinnings themselves went straight to the table. Nothing wasted. In a good year, a family ate spring onions from May to September without buying a single one. They were the small green currency of the allotment, cheap, reliable, and always there when the purse was empty and the tea still had to be made. Number 21. Marrow. The marrow was the allotment's showpiece, and its safety net all at once. Left to swell on a heap of last year's compost, it grew enormous with almost no attention, one plant sprawling across a corner and producing marrows the size of a child's leg. For families counting every penny, that abundance was a gift. A single fruit fed a household for 2 or 3 meals. Stuffed with a little minced meat and breadcrumbs, or simply boiled and served with a white sauce, the marrow stretched a scrap of protein into supper. Men competed at village shows over who could grow the biggest, marking them proudly with initials scratched into the young skin. The flavor was mild, some said watery, but that missed the point. It was bulk, it was free, and it kept for weeks in a cool larder. Where the soil was poorest, the marrow still delivered. Number 20. Jerusalem artichokes. Jerusalem artichokes were the crop nobody could kill. Knobbly tubers shoved into the ground in a forgotten corner would spread year after year, throwing up tall sunflower stalks and multiplying underground without a scrap of care. For families with poor, stony soil and no money for fancy planting, this reliability was everything. You dug them as you needed them through the winter, leaving the rest in the ground where the frost couldn't spoil them. Roasted in a little dripping or simmered into a pale, sweet soup, they filled bellies when the main crops ran low. There was a price, of course. The wind they caused was the stuff of family legend, and children learned to brace for it. But hunger silenced complaints. A handful of tubers begged from a neighbor could feed a family for years, spreading like a quiet promise beneath the frozen ground. Number 19. Shallots. Shallots held pride of place in the thrifty gardener's calendar, traditionally planted on the shortest day and lifted on the longest. From a single bulb pressed into the soil grew a whole cluster, multiplying the harvest many times over. The closest thing an allotment offered to money, for nothing. Poor families prized them for keeping right through winter, plaited into ropes and hung in the shed or scullery where they stayed sound for months. Milder and sweeter than onions, they went into stews, pickled jars, and the Sunday gravy. The pickling ritual was almost sacred. Shallots peeled by hand until fingers stung, packed into jars with malt vinegar, and set aside for Christmas cold meats. A few shillings of starter bulbs, saved back each year, meant a family never had to buy again. In the quiet economy of the garden, the shallot repaid its keeper more generously than almost anything else. Number 18. Rhubarb. Rhubarb blurred the line between vegetable and pudding, and no poor family's garden was complete without a clump of it by the back fence. Once established, it came up faithfully every spring for decades, asking for nothing but an old bucket over the crown to force the tender pink stems early. A neighbor's spare root, dug and shared, was all it took to start, and it never had to be bought again. When sugar was scarce and puddings a luxury, stewed rhubarb sweetened with the last of the ration and served with a thin custard was a treat that cost almost nothing. Children pulled a raw stalk, dipped it in a twist of sugar, and puckered at the sourness. Some families forced it in the dark under a chimney pot for the sweetest, palest stems of all. Reliable, generous, and endlessly forgiving, rhubarb was the pudding that grew itself. Number 17. Spinach. Spinach was the crop that grew when little else would, thriving in the cool, damp corners other vegetables refused. For families short of everything, that toughness made it precious, a green leaf you could cut in the miserable weather of early spring and late autumn, filling the calendar's hungriest gaps. Perpetual spinach, the hardier kind, was sown once and cut again and again, a single row giving leaves for the best part of a year. Wilted down in a pan with a knob of margarine, a great heap of it shrank to a modest serving, but it carried iron and goodness at a time when meat was rare. Mothers pressed it on reluctant children as a tonic, insisting it built strong blood. Cheap seed, hard-wearing plants, and a stubborn refusal to die in bad weather made spinach the quiet workhorse of the poor family's plot. Number 16. Kale. Kale, or borecole as the old gardening books called it, was the vegetable of last resort, and it never let a family down. When frost blackened everything else and the ground rang hard underfoot, kale stood tall and green in the allotment, sweeter for the cold that would have killed a lesser plant. For the poorest households, this was survival food in the truest sense. Fresh greens in January and February when the shops were bare and the purse was empty. The curly leaves were stripped from the stems, boiled hard, and served with a scrape of dripping to fend off the winter. It grew in the worst soil, shrugged off the harshest weather, and cropped for months on end from a handful of penny seeds. Plain and coarse it may have been, but kale was the crop that stood between a family and an empty plate in the dead heart of winter. Number 15. Beetroot. Beetroot earned its place through sheer staying power, a crop that fed a family long after the growing was done. Sown in spring and lifted in autumn, the deep crimson roots were boiled, then packed into jars of vinegar, where they kept for months, a jewel-bright splash of color on the winter tea table. For families who could rarely afford fresh vegetables out of season, a well-stocked shelf of pickled beetroot was quiet wealth. Seed cost pennies, and the roots stored beautifully in a box of sand in the shed. Sliced onto bread and butter, served beside cold meat, or grated raw into a salad, beetroot brought sweetness and a stain that children wore proudly on their fingers. The leaves, too, went into the pot rather than the bin, cooked like spinach. Nothing was wasted, and little rewarded the effort so richly. On grey days, that ruby color alone was worth the growing. Number 14. Purple sprouting broccoli. Purple sprouting broccoli was the patient gardener's reward, a crop sown in one year and harvested in the lean days of the next. It sat in the ground all through the winter, taking up space and asking for faith. Then, in the hungry gap of early spring, when stores were exhausted and nothing new had come, it burst into tender purple shoots just when they were needed most. For poor families, that timing was everything, filling the plate in the very weeks the larder stood emptiest. The more you picked, the more it threw out, cropping for weeks from a single row. Steamed briefly and served with a knob of margarine, the shoots tasted of green freshness after a winter of stored roots and cabbage. It demanded patience and a gardener willing to plan a year ahead, but for the household that could wait, it paid back handsomely when the paydays were thinnest. Number 13. Turnips. Turnips were the emergency crop, the vegetable a family could rely on when all else failed. Quick to grow and cheap as anything from a packet, they could be sown late to fill a gap left by a failed harvest and still crop before the frosts. The white and purple roots stored well in a clamp of straw and earth, feeding a household right through the cold months. Diced into stews and broths, they stretched a scrap of meat into a meal for 6, their peppery bite lending body to the thinnest pot. The young leaves, or turnip tops, were boiled as spring greens, a second harvest from the same seed. In the hardest times, turnips carried a whiff of the workhouse about them, a poverty food nobody boasted of, but they filled bellies cheaply and reliably, and for families with nothing to spare, that was the only measure that mattered. Number 12. Cauliflower. Cauliflower was the ambitious grower's prize, the vegetable that proved a poor family's plot could produce something fine. It was not the easiest crop, It demanded rich soil, steady watering, and a careful eye, snapping the outer leaves over the white curd to shield it from the sun. But a good head, grown for pennies, would have cost dear at the greengrocer, and that saving made the effort worthwhile. On a Sunday, cauliflower cheese turned a few ounces of cheese ration into a dish that fed the whole family, its creamy sauce making a little go a long way. Nothing was wasted. The tough stalk went into soup, the leaves into the stock pot. Gardeners timed their sowings to spread the harvest, dreading the glut that came when every head matured at once. For all its fussiness, a perfect cauliflower was a badge of skill, proof that even a hard-up household could grow something to be proud of. Number 11. Peas. Few things marked the arrival of summer like the first picking of garden peas. Poor families grew them up, rows of hazel sticks and old netting, the pods swelling green and fat in June. And for a few precious weeks, the table was rich with a sweetness that no tinned pea could match. Podding was a family affair, children set to the task on the back step, eating as many raw as ever reached the pan, the reward for the work. A penny packet of seed gave rows of pods, and the plants gave back to the soil what they took, enriching the ground for the crop that followed. What couldn't be eaten fresh was dried for winter, hardening into pulses that softened again in the long simmered soups of the cold months. Fresh in summer, dried in winter, and enriching the earth all the while, the humble pea earned its keep 3 times over. Number 10. Broad beans. Broad beans were the hardiest of the pod crops, sown in autumn to sit out the winter and steal a march on spring. For families who could not afford to lose a season, that head start was priceless. Beans cropping in early summer when money and food were both at their thinnest. The plants asked little, standing up to frost and wind, and a handful of saved beans replanted each year meant a family need never buy seed again. The young pods were eaten whole. The older beans slipped from their velvety cases to be boiled soft and dressed with a scrap of butter or parsley. Even the leafy tops were pinched out and cooked as greens, keeping the black fly at bay in the bargain. Filling, nourishing, and forgiving of the poorest ground, broad beans were the reliable backbone of the early summer plot, feeding families before the rest of the garden had woken up. Number 9. Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts were the taste of a British Christmas, but for poor families they were far more than a festive luxury. They were a winter workhorse. Sown in spring and standing firm through the harshest weather, they cropped from November right through to February, the buttons sweetening with every frost. A single tall stalk carried dozens of sprouts, picked a few at a time from the bottom up over many weeks, so a short row fed a family for the whole cold season. Cheap seed and stubborn hardiness made them ideal for the thrifty plot, delivering fresh green food in the very months the ground gave up almost everything else. Boiled, sometimes to a grey mush that children learned to dread, they nonetheless kept the winter sniffles at bay and put vegetables on the plate when little else could. Loved or loathed, the sprout stood loyal in the frozen allotment when the family needed it most. Number 8. Parsnips. Parsnips were the sweet secret of the winter garden, a root that actually improved when the weather turned bitter. Left in the ground through the frosts, their starches turned to sugar, and poor families dug them as needed, knowing the cold cellar of the earth kept them better than any shed. For households where sweetness was rationed and treats were rare, that natural sugar was a quiet gift. Roasted in the fat around the Sunday joint, they crisped and caramelized into something close to a delicacy. Boiled and mashed, they stretched the potato and thickened the winter stew. A penny packet of seed, sown in spring and forgotten until the cold set in, rewarded the patient gardener months later. Slow to grow and easy to overlook, The parsnip repaid its keeper in the leanest weeks of the year, turning frost and hardship into the sweetest root on the whole plot. Number 7. Swede. The Swede was the great belly filler of the poor British kitchen, a heavy orange root that turned a few pennies of seed into weeks of dinners. Hardy beyond almost any other crop, it sat out the winter in the ground or stored for months in a clamp, always there when the money ran out before the week did. Diced into stews and hot pots, it soaked up the flavor of what little meat there was and made it go twice as far. Mashed with a knob of margarine and a good grind of pepper, neeps to the Scots, bashed together with curate in the south, it was cheap, filling comfort on a cold plate. Some families fed the trimmings to the pig and ate the rest themselves, wasting not a scrap. Coarse, humble, and utterly dependable, the Swede asked for nothing and gave a family bulk and warmth when both were desperately needed. Number 6. Runner beans. No crop rewarded a small plot like the runner bean. Trained up towering wigwams of hazel poles, a short row climbed skyward and cropped for months. A handful of penny seeds producing an avalanche of long green pods from July until the first frosts. For poor families, that sheer productivity was a godsend. So generous, in fact, that the glut became a problem all its own. What couldn't be eaten fresh was sliced and layered in earthenware crocks with salt, preserved to feed the family deep into winter when the garden lay bare. Picked young and stringed and sliced, served with a scrap of bacon or simply with butter, runner beans were summer on a plate. Gardeners swapped seed over the fence and competed quietly over whose poles climbed highest. Cheap, prolific, and beautiful in scarlet flower, the runner bean gave more food per foot of soil than almost anything a hard-up family could grow. Number 5. Onions. The onion was the flavor that made poverty food bearable. Almost every dish in the poor British kitchen began with an onion softening in a little fat. The base of the stew, the soul of the gravy, the thing that turned bread and scraps into something that smelled like a meal. Grown from tiny sets pressed into spring soil, they cost next to nothing and stored for months, plaited into ropes that hung in the scullery through the whole of winter. A well-grown crop meant a family never had to buy the one ingredient no cook could do without. Sliced raw into a cheese sandwich, fried golden for liver and onions, or simmered slow into a soup that cost mere pennies, the onion stretched everywhere. Men grew giant show onions for pride and swapped sets across allotment paths. Humble and everyday, it was nonetheless the seasoning that stood between a hungry family and a plate of nothing much at all. Number 4. Leeks. The leek was the pride of the poor man's garden, nowhere more so than in the mining valleys of Wales and the pit villages of the northeast. Standing firm through the bitterest frost, it gave fresh, sweet, green food in the depths of winter when the allotment was otherwise bare, a lifeline in the months that broke weaker crops. For families where every meal was a calculation, the leek's toughness was priceless. Simmered into caul or a thick winter broth, it lent a gentle sweetness that made a scrap of bacon taste like a feast. But the leek was more than food. In the northeast, working men grew championship leeks with almost religious devotion, feeding them secret concoctions and guarding their prize specimens, competing at pub shows for a prize pig or a few pounds. Hardy, sweet, and stitched into local pride, the leek fed the body and the soul alike when times were hard. Number 3. Carrots. No vegetable was pushed harder on the wartime and post-war family than the carrot. The government's cheerful Dr. Carrot told children that carrots helped them see in the blackout. and Britain dug them by the ton. For poor families, the carrot was a near-perfect crop. Cheap seed, heavy yields, and roots that stored for months in boxes of sand through the winter. A penny packet lined a long row, and the harvest sweetened the plainest stew, grated into the thriftiest cake, or simply scrubbed and eaten raw by children as a treat when sweets were rationed. Their bright orange lifted the greyest winter plate. The feathery tops warned of carrot fly, the gardener's great enemy, kept off with barriers and companion rows of onions. Sweet, versatile, storable, and endlessly cheap, the carrot did the work of a dozen more expensive vegetables, the reliable friend of every family stretching a shilling until it snapped. Number 2. Cabbage. If the potato kept British families alive, the cabbage kept them fed the rest of the time. No vegetable worked harder on the poor family's plot. Sown in succession, a gardener could cut cabbage in almost every month of the year, from tight spring greens to the great solid winter heads that stood firm against the frost. Cheap seed produced a wall of dense, heavy leaves, and a single row went a very long way. Boiled too long, more often than not. Until the whole street could smell it, it was the everyday green beside the Sunday joint. The leftovers were fried the next morning into bubble and squeak, nothing thrown away. Shredded raw, it stretched into slaws. Simmered slow, it thickened a broth. Hardy, prolific, and endlessly adaptable, the cabbage asked little of the poorest soil and gave back a year-round supply of fresh green food. It was the true, unglamorous backbone of the working family's table. And finally, in first place, the potato, the crop that kept more British families alive than any other. When money vanished and the cupboard stood bare, it was the potato that stood between a household and real hunger. A few pounds of seed potatoes, chitted on the windowsill and planted in spring, returned a harvest that could feed a family for months, stored in sacks and clamps through the whole of winter. No other crop gave so much food from so little ground. Boiled, mashed, roasted in a scrape of dripping, or baked in their jackets in the embers of the fire, potatoes filled plates and bellies at almost no cost. Potato Pete urged wartime families to grow and eat them by the barrowload, and grow them they did. In the leanest years, a good potato patch was not a luxury, but a form of insurance. The humble tuber that carried Britain's poor through hard times and asked for nothing in return but a patch of dug earth and a little hope. From a saucer of cress on the windowsill to the potato patch that kept whole families fed, these 25 vegetables tell one story of hard-up households that turned a strip of soil into the difference between hunger and getting by. Nothing was wasted, nothing was bought that could be grown, and every row was a small act of defiance against a tight week and an empty purse. If your own nan or granddad grew any of these, tell me which in the comments. I'd love to know what fed your family when money was tight.